I know you're not going to get an impromptu concert, but having said that, this particular instrument is something I'd like to use as an analogy today. And having said that, I'd like you to try and get more out of your cost control than you do now. And the analogy is, with an instrument like this, it's about 100 years old, was actually played by a person from the Sydney Symphonic Orchestra, back when it was the BBC Radio Orchestra, and that was back in the late 1920s, 1930s. When I got it, it had seized up completely. It hadn't been used in over 70 years. And so I did the basic things. I thought, okay, I'll get all the valves working, I'll get all the slides moving, but then I had to do some other things as well. I had to do some blanket things to cover things that I didn't know were in here. And yes, inside this, insects at some point in that 70 years had made their home. So before I got it playing, I had to make sure I cleared all of them out. And that's part of the analogy. When you're using cost control, yes, you've still got to do everything from the basics, like getting the valves to move, but you've also got to cover blanket things you might not even know are there. Because you can spend your time trying to find that one or two things that has gone wrong once and then may not go wrong again, or you trying to find a blanket that can cover as many of them as possible. So my previous speaker most certainly put up some numbers, and I put up some that I found out of a basic AI search and some basic articles. I'd like to say that most of those numbers are wrong. When it comes to cost control and sustaining cost savings, I actually don't think you can do that. What I think you can do, and from our experience at Flight Centre, we found that we can most certainly sustain more like 10% cost savings across a long period of time. The only place where we could get better was when we introduced cost tools like Datadog. Now, I'm going to be honest, I use both Datadog and Power BI for my cost control in about equal measure. But having said that, I use Datadog for specific things that you'll find evidence in a moment. So for me, I'm a bit of a basketball fan. I'm a big band nut. I play trumpet on occasion, but my main instrument's a trombone and bass trombone. Needless to say, they wouldn't fit on the aircraft. I'm from Brisbane, by the way. Flight Centre's centred out of Brisbane, and I work in their corporate area. And in their corporate area, I look after the DevOps, platform engineering, cost control, training for a small group of people. I look at, say, all the corporate arm, and Flight Centre is headquartered out of Brisbane, and we have 90 countries, about 30 companies, and in the cost control space, we have about 190 subscriptions. So out of that, I get to look in on about 40 of them, but I get loaned out from time to the other 190. Now, everybody before me's had a pyramid. I've got an iceberg. Now, our iceberg is basically looking at how do we develop our strategy for both cost and observability. Here, we look at both ends. So we're trying to work from engaging with the stakeholders, the support people, the executives, as well as engaging with the engineers. And from the bottom up, we're trying to engage the engineers in their key areas of finding the exceptions, making sure their apps are working the way they're supposed to, but also how much are these things costing? And how much is that also being presented to the support people and making sure they can get something out of it as well. So we're asking them questions like, what do they need? What do they expect from the metrics that they're going to see? So a couple of stories, a couple of ways that we've built our cost control to do just a little bit more than the cost is that we've had things like rogue network interfaces. We had a situation where a SSL request was coming from another part of the business, and it produced a slightly larger than expected result. In this case, we had some of our colleagues in India try and get hold of some of our resources in Australia, but because of the firewall setup, we had some interesting peering requests. And that peering request went up to, let's call it 2 million%. Oh yeah, and by the way, if you're doing the math in your head, what's 2 million% from $500? That's about 3 cents. So basically, we didn't discover it when it was 2 million, we saw it as 10, 20% at the top level when it said VPN peering. So we had to then dig down, and needless to say, the 2 million stood out. But we had some hooks, and we had some things telling us that the 10% had caused a rise in our costs, so we went in to have a look. And what we discovered was that we had some staff making requests of certain systems that they should have built in India rather than back here in Australia. So that's what we asked them to do. Using the Datadog tool, we dug in, and that's where we found the 2 million%. Now, of course, the boss was happy to hear rather than, oh yeah, at the end of the month, we spent an extra $16,000 because we didn't capture. But we did, we caught it, and so we managed to steer clear of about $16,000 extra cost that we otherwise didn't have to put up with. And yes, a few days later, somebody in India who hadn't read the memo or the Teams message or that had been to the stand-up turned it back on. So we then had to, of course, turn it back off and then delete it and then help them build their own. And as you can see from Datadog, there are quite a few places you can check in to see where these things are happening. In a second story, quite recently we did a Java upgrade. I'm sure some of you have done a few of those. But in our case, we had some dependencies in other systems that we really didn't know that we had. And I'd like to call it out that not everybody knows all the dependencies, particularly in companies that are large sizes. So how do you look at dependencies that otherwise you wouldn't capture? Well, our logs told us. Our logs didn't just double, they tripled over a 3-day period. You might ask, okay, well, why was that? What had happened was, out of setting up 20 different Java upgrades, we then had a separate system that had a small dependency that hadn't started building its errors up until 2 to 3 days later. So again, we were monitoring this. We made sure that we had thresholds that were monitoring it. So that meant we were able to go in. Yes, it was a day later because our ingestion for all our data, as you can probably hear, having 190 odd subscriptions, we have about 45 in this particular Datadog setup. We had a day later finding it. So one of the things that I think is key to when you're trying to build your thresholds is you've got a 3-rule system in the way we do it. We make sure that we've got the time frame set correctly. We make sure that we know where, and this is one of those adages, sometimes you can pick a really small space, sometimes you pick a really big one, but as the previous speaker rightfully pointed out, it's got to match your environment. One of the things that we find, this is a living system. You can't just set your threshold and forget about it. You have to be part of it, your process has to be where somebody is making sure that your dynamics, things are dynamic and that things are always being checked on a regular basis. Case in point, we might build a new client, a new system, and we might onboard them, and our orders might go up for travel, might go up by 20%. Our thresholds have just become null and void. And I can guarantee you my engineers are going to be ringing me up going, why am I getting 1,000 messages? Why? Because our thresholds were set too low. So what we do is we make sure we onboard clients, we make sure that our thresholds then change with the volume that might change with it. The third rule is make sure you've set your thresholds for a bar that is reasonable. And not a bar that's going to give you too much noise, but at the same time, not a bar that is too high that you really do want to know before it happens. With my last example, we had it set for anything over $50 and 20%. So it's a combination of things. It's not necessarily just a one. Try and build a combination of factors so that when you do get the alert, you've been guaranteed that it's already checked multiple things for you before you've gotten the message. Now, out of the box, Datadog's pretty good, I'll call it, but having said that, I'd like to go a little bit more granular. So when I looked at it, I went, yeah, I like the information, but I think you can do better. So I did. I went in and found out what I could do behind the scenes. I made it a little bit more granular. And I think you can too. So some of the things you might be able to look in on Datadog is that you can set up different variables, and some of the tips I'd use would be always check your formulas and do it outside of the tool. I'm not saying you shouldn't trust the tool, but having said that, there are so many variables you can set, you need to know the numbers that you're expecting before you go in. Because that way then you can check to see that your formulas are right, you've set the correct variables, you've set the correct times, and that way you get a better outcome and not having to spend half an hour going, I wonder why that number's not what I'm expecting. And some of those tips are, make sure your values, if you're going to put a value in against another, and here in my example, I wanted to know how many logs we had in our contract. Can I put the value inside my formula? Yes. Can I put it as a separate entity inside that line? Well, yes, you can, but there's a trick, A times 0. If you don't do that, it'll appear on a separate line on its own. Bugged the hell out of me for about 30 minutes. Then I found it. And then I went to the Datadog text and went, is there another way to do this? And they went, no, you found it. That's how you include it on the same line. Some of the other tips I would put out for you is when you're doing a time shift, if you're doing averages or any other formulas that require you to go back and do trends, always set them to -1, -2, -3, by whichever one you're measuring, day, week, month. And it's the same for any time preferences you set. So if you're doing your report to say, I want the last 4 weeks, you need to set it for the previous week as your time preference. Trust me, if you set it the other way, your figures will change and they won't be what you're expecting. And it's great for using for things like averages. And as you can see in my example, we were using at this point in time, we were using 200% of the logs that we'd actually paid for. One of the other things that we needed to do in our cost control was making sure our tags were right. And it wasn't that we got our tags wrong, it was that we had trouble making it stick. And one of our things as part of our journey was we had to make sure we kept our finance people happy. So yes, one of our things that's big is we need to make sure that when people were typing in their cost information, and particularly the cost codes that our finance people love, that they weren't fat fingering, that they weren't doing typos. So we used things like in Azure, we were using Azure policies to make sure that the 6-digit code was always a 6-digit code. And you might think, okay, why is that important? Well, the number of times that over 190 subscriptions, over 30 or 40 different countries that I look after, I can say with absolute certainty, someone's going to fat finger it. If they're typing it in, someone's going to get more than 6 characters, or they're going to be less than 6 characters, or one will be a letter when it should be a number. All of those things come into play. And when you're using reports that then base the costs based on these cost codes, they're then off by however much or however many you've got of these lovely typos. Other things that we did is we made living, breathing systems. Yes, you can set your tags once, but always make sure that you've got some way of keeping them going, either using a policy or using audits. In our case, we do both. So what's next? For us, we're going to try and make sure that we're using AI in our cost control. We're going to continue to work from both ends. We've got to get better at making sure that we involve both our support, our engineers, and our executives in the process. And we've got to figure out how we can use impact in our calculations in terms of knowing if an incident happens, can we use our calculations and the things we know about cost in knowing how much that's impacted our business. So when it comes to AI, some of the things we're working on Datadog with is we're looking at things like better language, and I'm talking about plain language, not just the tech language that we use behind the scenes, but how do we make that plain language in the executive and the support areas that much better. We're also wanting to make sure that we can do, like the trumpet, we want to make sure that we can put blankets over things, that we can capture as many things as we can without everyone having to know every dependency and everyone having to know every system. Because needless to say, we've got such a large set of legacy and non-legacy systems, not one person can know them all. The other areas we're wanting to work on with Datadog is dynamic thresholds. So yes, we can set them manually, as we showed in the example. Hopefully in the next couple of iterations, there'll be the ability to do more dynamic threshold setting and more investigations around better and better recommendations. The other strategy is when we're doing things with the different stakeholders, we want them to know why costs are the way they are. And that's one of the benefits of having tools like this is you can then provide reports, you can provide metrics that actually show why costs are the way they are. And that's something we want to continue to build on. And last but not least, what I want to do is I want to make sure when I'm doing cost control that we're building in links to things like MTT, mean time, for acknowledging, detecting, resolving incidences, and being able to put that next to the cost of what that incident cost the business. So if you've got all the costs already in one place, there's no reason why you can't use those calculations and put them in play when an incident happens, showing up what that incident actually cost you and the business. So thanks for listening to my talk. And even if you just remember me as the trumpet guy, that'd be great. But even if you don't, try and get more out of your cost control tools, particularly when it comes to managing incidents, because your costs can often be a lag indicator of what's actually going on in your system. And we've been able to use that with great success. Those 2 recent examples are just from the last 2 months. I could have gone back further, but those are the most recent. So again, thank you for your time. And by all means, if you want to talk big band or anything else, by all means, give me give me a buzz.